It is 1923. On the central coast of California, an army of workers are building the biggest motion picture set in history. The city of the Pharaoh. It was built for the silent version of Cecil B. DeMille's epic, The Ten Commandments. Nearly 800 feet wide, over 100 feet tall. There had never been anything like it. When filming was completed, the whole thing mysteriously vanished. I think I was about 5 when I saw the Charlton Heston version of the Ten Commandments. It's the first film I remember seeing. And I think it stayed with me not so much in a spiritual sense as in the sense of how did they do that? And how did they affect me so much with this image they put on the screen? That probably had a lot to do with my interest in movies and with me going to film school later on. I first heard about the Lost City one night in 1982. My house had just burned down. I'd moved in with Bruce Cardozo, who was an old friend from the NYU Film School. One night, he began telling me this crazy story about Cecil B. DeMille burying sphinxes in the middle of California. I thought Bruce was nuts, but then he showed me a quote from DeMille's autobiography.
If 1,000 years from now, archaeologists happen to dig beneath the sands of Guadalupe, I hope they will not rush into print with the amazing news that Egyptian civilization extended all the way to the Pacific coast of North America. The sphinxes they will find were buried there when we had finished with them.
We thought, okay, we'll find the set, we'll get some archaeologists to dig it up, we'll film interviews with old-timers who worked on the film. The story writes itself. When I went to bed that night, my head was spinning.
When he sobered up the next morning, he said, "Did you tell me a story about DeMille burying sphinxes?" You know, he wasn't even sure that I told him that. I said, "Yeah, I did," and he became very fascinated by it. It sparked his imagination.
The first question was, where the hell is Guadalupe? Turns out Guadalupe is a tiny town about 150 miles north of Hollywood. We wanted to go right away, but this was 1982-83, the first El Nino winter, one bad storm after another. So I hit the archives. If there was one fitting symbol for the excitement of the silent age, it was the great sets that rose over the backyards of Hollywood. It began in 1916 when D.W. Griffith built the city of Babylon for his epic Intolerance. There was Robin Hood's castle for Douglas Fairbanks, the Queen of Sheba's palace on Sunset Boulevard, and the whole city of Monte Carlo for Erich von Stroheim. But when it came to great sets, nobody built them greater than Cecil B. DeMille. In 1927, he built the city of Jerusalem for his epic King of Kings. A few years later, the same set was dressed up with bamboo and palm trees to provide the backdrop for a very different king. This great set played its final role in 1939 when it was put to the torch. The flames could be seen for miles, and DeMille's city of Jerusalem was gone with the wind. DeMille's City of the Pharaoh might still be with us, the last of the great sets. Finally, the rain ended. I made a lot of phone calls and soon found a restaurant owner named Clarence Minetti, one of the owners of the Guadalupe Dunes. Clarence introduced me to a friend of his named Joe Gray, and one morning in June of 1983, Joe led us out to the site.
We saw this big sand dune, and he looks at us, and he points up and goes, "Well, there it is." And we start running up this sand dune. And we get to the top, and we see a lot of debris all over the surface. We all immediately started to dig.
All those El Nino storms had blown several feet of sand off the dunes. There were acres of buried statues poking out of the sand. It was a wonderland. Digging gently with whisk brooms, we soon uncovered treasure. We realized DeMille did not just bury some sphinxes, he'd buried the whole set. We're trying to save an ancient Egyptian city in the middle of California. It's hard to do that with a completely straight face. But on the other hand, we are trying to save an important artifact, an important piece of American history, of film history. There were still a lot of people alive who had worked on this film with DeMille. These people had stories to tell, a piece of cinema history. We began filming interviews, and it wasn't long before we put together a pretty good picture of what happened when the little town of Guadalupe welcomed Cecil B. DeMille. Without Cecil B. DeMille, there would be no Hollywood. It really is that fundamental. His films always had the biggest sets, the biggest budgets, and usually the biggest profits. No other filmmaker did so much to make the name Hollywood synonymous with movies. Cecil Blount DeMille was born in 1881 to a Broadway theatrical family. He was an actor, a playwright. He managed a theater company. He was always broke. So in 1913, he took a gamble on something new: movies. DeMille's mother introduced him to two influential friends, Broadway producer Jesse Lasky and Lasky's brother-in-law, Sam Goldwyn. They formed a production company and bought the rights to a Broadway play, a shoot-'em-up Western. Soon, DeMille was on a train bound for that movie-making mecca of Flagstaff, Arizona. One story goes that he arrived in the middle of a blinding snowstorm, so he got back on the train and bought a ticket to the very last stop, a peaceful little village at the very end of the line. The movies would never be the same, nor would that peaceful little village. Barely off the train, DeMille rented a barn, called it a studio, and made Hollywood's first feature film, The Squaw Man. It was an immense success. The legend of Cecil B. DeMille had begun. 70 years later, the name of Cecil B. DeMille still commanded attention. It wasn't long before the publicity started. Soon we had a group of volunteers who got started on mapping and surveys. It wasn't a real archaeological excavation yet, but it was a promising start. The publicity continued. Oh man, we thought this thing is taking off like a rocket. We still had no funding, but we continued filming interviews and doing research. After The Squaw Man, DeMille's output was staggering, 20 films in the first 2 years. The company was soon joined by a tight-fisted businessman, Adolf Zukor. A new industry and a new art form were being born.
It was like an open guild with an enthusiasm and a participation and a caring that was family caring.
There were no rule books, no guidelines. DeMille was one of the pioneers inventing how to make movies. Sam Goldwyn was inventing how to sell them.
They were all experimenting with light and shadow, and everything they did was new. And Grandfather was experimenting with shadow, and he sent the film to Sam. And he said, how am I supposed to sell this? You can only see half an actor's face. It was in his telegram. And DeMille shot back a telegram saying, if you don't know Rembrandt lighting when you see it, I can't help you. Sam said, oh, Rembrandt lighting, we could charge double for this.
DeMille was joined by his brother, William, also a filmmaker, and William's daughter, Agnes.
And then, you know, every time Cecil did something remarkable, like sinking the Lusitania, or burning Joan of Arc, or throwing somebody to the lions, or somebody else to the crocodiles, or whatever, we'd all get away from school as though it were a national holiday and go down to the studio and watch the horrors. And it was very like a communal picnic.
DeMille was learning that movies could fill a screen with images no one had dreamed of before. There was a whole new visual language of cuts, close-ups, fades. DeMille became its master.
His strengths were that he had a tremendous vision for entertainment and showmanship that the public would enjoy. Nobody ever walked out of a DeMille film. Maybe the critics did, but the public didn't. He knew that the public loves a show and a circus on the grand scale.
Cecil made pronouncements about what the people liked, what the people wanted, what the public wanted. Nobody knows what the public wants. They want a public hanging, that's what they want. But not failing to have that, there are other things.
And as any schoolboy could tell you, those other things include sex. DeMille dished out plenty of it, and the public loved it.
It was young, moist, adolescent pipe dreams. This was his ideal woman, Gloria Swanson, in her fantastic clothes, with her hair all wrapped around her head and looking like nothing on God's earth. But she was, I must say, quite remarkable.
DeMille apparently found something wanting in all this success, the result perhaps of his own unique background. DeMille's father, Henry, was a playwright and an Episcopalian minister. Every night he read to his children from the Old and New Testaments. DeMille's mother, Beatrice, was a Broadway agent and Jewish. DeMille took this dual heritage to heart.
He had an enormous sense of almost that Old Testament relationship with God. I think he felt a kind of direct line. I think he felt inspired.
He did have a love of the Bible, a real deep one, and a profound understanding of it, and a profound, he relied on it. He knew it by heart. That man knew his Bible. It was God's word, and you stood on it.
In October 1922, the Sunday Los Angeles Times sponsored a contest. $1,000 was offered to the reader who suggested the winning idea for DeMille's next film. Of the 30,000 entries, one began with the words, "You cannot break the 10 Commandments, they will break you." Adolf Zucker was horrified.
Cecil, the public does not want to watch old man running around in bed sheets.
But DeMille was already in pre-production for the 10 Commandments.
It was the ideal spectacle, the Exodus, in which a people burst out of bondage. To him was emotionally and visually one of the great experiences of mankind.
DeMille's longtime screenwriter, Jeannie McPherson, would write the screenplay. After many drafts, she created a 2-part story, a modern story in which the 10 Commandments were the moral theme, preceded by the biblical story of Moses and the Exodus. Although the modern story would be longer, it was that biblical prologue that required a production of epic proportions. For visual inspiration, DeMille turned to the Bible illustrations of Gustave Doré, whose work DeMille adored as a child. To design the great set of the Pharaoh's city, DeMille brought in art director Paul E. Reeb, later famed as the father of Art Deco. DeMille provided extensive research, and Reeb created a design that was authentic Egypt, but with an early Art Deco flourish. In size and style, it would be unlike anything seen before. All of which worried Adolf Zucker. The projected budget was already nearing $500,000. When DeMille announced that he wanted to film in Egypt, Zucker threatened to cancel the entire production. Jesse Lasky intervened with a suggestion. The year before, Lasky had produced The Sheik with Rudolph Valentino in a dramatic stretch of sand dunes just a few hours from Hollywood, the Guadalupe Dunes. Why not film the 10 Commandments there? DeMille gave in and arranged to rent the dunes from their owner, the Union Sugar Company, for the sum of $10. Adolf Zucker approved. By the 1980s, things in Guadalupe had gotten a little more complicated than a $10 contract. To mount an excavation, we would need a professional archaeologist, and we'd need permission from the county of Santa Barbara. We soon found an archaeologist, a real good one, at the University of California's Santa Barbara campus. He figured it would cost between $40,000 and $50,000 to mount an excavation. I asked him about getting the okay from the county of Santa Barbara, and he said, "Don't talk to them yourself. You are from Los Angeles, they'll rake you over the coals." Well, I didn't believe him, so I made my first visit to Anapamu Street. Now, Anapamu Street is where the permit people live. If you want to scratch your nose in Santa Barbara, you need to get a permit here. I would become very familiar with this place in coming years. I met with a young lady named Kit something or other, and she proceeded to rake me over the coals. She was like, "How dare you want to come up here and play in our sand dunes?" She started talking about a special use permit, a conditional use permit, a pre-permit permit application permit, and the dreaded coastal development permit. This is what you would need to build a hotel in the dunes, and all of this would take years and cost tens of thousands of dollars. I was in a state of shock. That night I told the archaeologist what had happened. He said, "See, I told you so. Now let me talk to them. They're my friends." Well, a couple of weeks later, I got a letter. He said he had spoken to his friends, and we now had an official County of Santa Barbara document stating that we did not need the coastal development permit. Exempt, just like that. Unfortunately, this would not be our last contact with the permit people. And that $40,000 or $50,000 estimate the archaeologist gave us, well, as the publicity grew, so did that estimate. When it approached $300,000, I pulled the plug and fired the archaeologist. Adolf Zucker would have been proud. Now it was 1985, and we had no archaeologist. To make matters worse, the syndicate that owned the dunes was selling them to the Nature Conservancy. It was a great idea, but a legal mess. Any excavation would have to wait. So we continued learning about the logistical miracle that DeMille and his team pulled off back in 1923. In April, Paul Iribe and a small group of artisans arrived in Guadalupe. In a few weeks, most of the locals were on the Ten Commandments payroll. More workers were brought in from San Francisco and Hollywood. 500 carpenters, 400 painters, 400 set decorators, 1,200 electricians and gardeners. Then there were the materials. 500,000 feet of lumber, 300 tons of plaster, 25,000 pounds of nails, 75 miles of cable to anchor the huge set against the ocean wind. In Los Angeles, sculptors worked around the clock on the 500 tons of plaster statues, including 4 massive statues of the pharaoh Ramses. Each was 35 feet high and weighed 35 tons. The statues were all built in segments. They'd be reassembled in Guadalupe. Then there were the props. Wagon makers worked on the biggest order for chariots in 1,000 years. Literally tons of grease paint and makeup was ordered, and thousands of costumes were designed and sewn, then quickly aged for realism. In late May, DeMille arrived in Guadalupe. He brought some of Hollywood's best cameramen with him. They would use a new process called Technicolor for key sequences. A tent city, quickly dubbed Camp DeMille, rose near the set. It would be home to 2,500 men, women, and children.
There was 250 tents for men, 250 tents for women. Then there was a big dining room. It was a tent also. There was an office building, which was a tent. Then the wardrobe tent was over near where the animals were. Then there were showers at one end of the tents, and there was no hot water. But it was cold and foggy, and you had to get that makeup off. It was greasy stuff. So you had to take a shower, a cold shower.
To feed this multitude, a fleet of 132 trucks ferried food in and garbage out. A single lunch at Camp DeMille called for 7,500 sandwiches, 2,500 apples and oranges, and 400 gallons of coffee.
They had the kitchen open 24 hours a day, so you could always get something to eat, hot coffee. They fed good and they paid good.
200 camels had been brought in from zoos around the country, and every available local farm animal was rented out.
Well, I come down once just on my horse, just to look and see what was going on, you know. So this guy, he said, you want to rent that horse out to us? And I said, no. I said, if I rent you my horse, will you haul me back to town in one of them Cadillacs? They had 3 Cadillacs, used to run back and forth into town, big touring cars. And I'd never seen one before, so I wanted to ride in one of those. He says, yeah, we'll haul you back in one of those Cadillacs. I said, okay, then you got a horse.
I was making, I was getting $18 a day plus $2 per horse, so I done all right for a while.
This guy brought in a bunch of horses that probably were never broken. I think he got the horses out of the hills. Anyway, the guys got on the horses.
Some were half broke and they went down the road there, so we're spilling Hollywood boys all over the road.
Maybe that's why DeMille decided to bring in professional horsemen to drive his 300 chariots. Soldiers from the 11th Cavalry and 76th Field Artillery in Monterey. Leading the troops was a young lieutenant named Tony McCullough. 20 years later, as General McCullough, he would send the famous nuts message at the Battle of the Bulge. But in 1923, he was working for General DeMille, and it was nuts.
The Army had been lured into cooperation, which they came to regret. Well, of course, artillery drivers are not chariot drivers. A great number of the chariots capsized, turned over, spun down, and a few soldiers ended up in the hospital.
DeMille's 10-year-old daughter, Cecilia, watched on horseback. When the Hollywood stuntmen refused to charge down a steep sand dune, DeMille turned to her for help.
And Grandfather said, Cecilia, run down that sand dune and show the men how to do it. She said, yes, Father, and ran down the sand dune on her horse and said, gentlemen, they all went down the sand dune.
After a day like that, there was only one thing thirsty troops wanted to do. So they headed for Guadalupe. At the height of Prohibition, Guadalupe had just what they wanted.
There was plenty of booze. Even the sheriff would come down from Santa Barbara, they get loaded too, you know, the head guy. And I don't want to mention Santa Maria names, but he picked up the district attorney here in Santa Maria, and they'd come down there and get loaded.
And the soldiers especially, it was like a Western scene in the movie, you know, how they park and stop in front of the saloons and tie their horses up and so on and so forth. Town didn't care. As long as those guys were having fun, they were making money.
There would be no such fun at Camp DeMille, where special patrols kept a lookout for illegal alcohol. Unhappy residents called the patrols DeMille's moral squads. The final day of filming was devoted to the great scene of the Exodus.
We got up very early in the morning, and Mr. DeMille, I remember him telling my mother, "Don't miss this, this is the big one." And he gave the signal, and they started out the gates. There were whole herds of sheep and donkeys and people and children and all sorts of livestock coming down. It was a thing that you could never forget. It was just too gigantic, you know. It was a whole population moving.
A handful of assistant directors handled the logistical nightmare.
Now the idea is to get 6 feet apart so it looked like there's more people, and then he spread us out for practically a mile. The assistant directors had to walk back and forth. All they had was a bullhorn, they called it, a megaphone, to talk to them. And that's the only way they communicated. And with 1,000 people, you had to get all those people in line just exactly the way they wanted. The assistant directors, which I would say weren't very good, they didn't help Cecil B. DeMille. He practically did that whole thing by himself down there. But he had a good eye. He could catch anybody, you know, with a wristwatch or eyeglasses or smoking cigarettes. That wasn't allowed.
One of DeMille's cameramen was Edward S. Curtis, famed for his film and photo studies of Native Americans. Curtis's influence is evident in the naturalistic beauty of the Exodus.
People who saw it were so moved that they broke into tears, that they hugged each other, that they wept aloud. It was a tremendous experience.
Among those marching in the Exodus was Leatrice Joy, one of the stars of the Ten Commandments and a close friend of DeMille. I interviewed her a few days before she died in 1985. She said there was something very important she wanted people to know.
One thing in particular was DeMille's great desire was to give to the screen the tremendous love that God had for his Jewish people.
DeMille brought 240 elderly Orthodox Jews up from Los Angeles. A rabbi and a kosher kitchen were brought to Camp DeMille to serve their needs. They were all recent immigrants from Palestine and Europe, and for them, this was the Exodus.
They gave you the impression that this was it. It was never done before. They were living that time, these people. They weren't acting. They were just back there in the Jewish days.
As the Exodus began, the elderly immigrants spontaneously began an ancient Hebrew chant. DeMille, it is said, was so moved, he burst into tears.
God almighty, if you ever heard anything so sad as the dirge of the Jewish people. And DeMille said, I think it'll be nice to have some real authentic Jewish love on that screen. And I think he gave it to us.
Of course, not everyone saw the Ten Commandments as a spiritual event. The Guadalupe filming was now costing Paramount $40,000 a day. And when the budget topped $1 million, Adolf Zucker pulled the plug.
You have lost your mind. Suspend production immediately. What do they want me to do? Stop filming and call it the 5 Commandments?
DeMille sent out an alarm to his friend A.P. Giannini, founder of Bank of America. Giannini and 2 other investors quickly raised $1 million. DeMille calmly offered to buy the picture from Zucker. Zucker relented, and DeMille completed the Exodus. A different kind of exodus was soon underway as DeMille's army of extras, soldiers, and animals dispersed. Nobody seemed to note or care that the great set of Pharaoh's city disappeared. Trying to find that set was becoming an epic in its own right. We had lots of volunteers, real archaeologists, and some serious amateurs. We soon established that there was a lot of statuary buried here, as well as a lot of smaller artifacts, things that would tell us about life on a 1923 movie set. And from the placement of the statues, we were able to figure out that the main set had been toppled over backwards. The media's fascination with the story astounded us. We even had support from Paramount. Barry Diller liked our project and helped with some early funding. Our film crew was attracting volunteers too, like a British guy who became our photographer.
This just seemed to be a gift from heaven in terms of the scope and the scale of the story. It's worthwhile on many levels. It's not just a silly California story, like some of the stories I've covered in this town.
We were still nowhere near digging up the lost city, but the story of Cecil B. DeMille had grabbed hold of us. In Hollywood, DeMille faced another challenge, the parting of the Red Sea. Moses had God's help. DeMille had his special effects team. After weeks of experiments, they found a way.
Oh, it was big, and it was deep, too. So I remember it was, I don't know, 4 or 5 feet anyway, maybe 6 feet deep. That was a lot of Jell-O.
Dana Walker was probably the last eyewitness to the secret parting of the Red Sea. As a boy in Hollywood, he and his buddies sneaked onto a Hollywood lot one day in 1923.
Here we were, 7 or 8, 9 years old. We used to go up there as a high board fence, and we didn't have much trouble getting over that fence. But here was the Red Sea, and the Red Sea was a tank about 50 feet across anyways. It was filled with Jell-O, gelatin, literally.
Special effects man Roy Pomeroy took shots of Hebrews and chariots filmed earlier in Guadalupe and planted them between the 2 mounds of quivering Jell-O.
We used to go over there and steal some of this gelatin and even tasted this stuff. I can't imagine why. It wasn't very clean.
Huge tanks of water just off screen provided the final touch. And when the same footage was reversed, the Red Sea miraculously parted.
I don't think we ate enough Jell-O to make much difference. They didn't notice that, but they didn't like us horsing around there. So, yes, we got nabbed more than once.
The 10 Commandments opened at the Egyptian Theater in Hollywood in December 1923. It was a smash. Filmgoers had never seen anything like the film's remarkable special effects. Of course, the film also had a spectacular orgy scene. This was, after all, a Cecil B. DeMille production. But it was the 10 Commandments' simple theme and fundamental values that struck a chord. Audiences were still weary from the First World War.
People really needed a ray of hope, and the 10 Commandments is a ray of hope. His father saw the theater as bringing more people to religion, and DeMille saw motion pictures as bringing more people to religion.
The film's final cost was $1.5 million. It took in almost 3 times that amount at the box office. It seemed that DeMille's vision was vindicated. Adolf Zukor never forgave DeMille's extravagance. After the 10 Commandments, the Guadalupe Dunes were a very busy place. For Hollywood filmmakers, the dunes were a perfect substitute for everything from the Wild West to the Sahara Desert. Sadly, many of these films are now considered lost. Only posters and photos survive. For a few years, some of DeMille's sphinxes were kept around Guadalupe. They were a popular spot for tourists and family photos. Eventually, these too disappeared. But as the years went by, locals began to suspect that something fishy had happened in the Guadalupe Dunes.
I've been on this ranch for 51 years. I went to work with my father-in-law in 1941, and we run cattle across here from that ranch to this ranch, across these sand dunes for years. And I noticed the other dunes move with the winds, but this mound here never moved. It's always been the same.
We, of course, were convinced DeMille had buried the whole set. We soon found one other person who agreed.
Why did he bury it? It was a very secretive operation.
As a boy, Jesse Lasky Jr. accompanied his father, Jesse Sr., to Guadalupe to watch the filming of the 10 Commandments. Young Jesse grew up to be a Hollywood screenwriter, often working for DeMille. In 1954, while Lasky was writing the second version of the 10 Commandments, DeMille let him in on the secret of why the set was buried.
This was a suspicious time. It was almost, in a sense, the Wild West time. There were great rivalries between the film companies. People were likely to move in and steal a set. Rival filmmakers would have rushed in and made a cheap version instantly and write themselves a little picture around it, you see. And I think, following the example of the true pharaohs, he buried it.
We were finally ready to start exploring that mysterious dune. We had a grant from Bank of America honoring their connection to the Ten Commandments. Not enough for a full excavation, but enough to prove that there really was something there. The Nature Conservancy, which now owned the dunes, gave us complete support. Hollywood Heritage would be our nonprofit sponsor. We still had our letter from the county telling us we did not need a coastal development permit, and we had a new archaeologist.
The methodology that I'm planning on using on this site is identical to the methodology that I've been using for the past 7 years on a 10,000-year-old Indian village site that I've been working on in Northern California. I'm impressed by the amount of preservation that exists out here, especially pieces that appear to have been covered up by sand. I suspect that there's quite a bit buried here still.
Shortly after the 1990 survey began, we spoke to some more Guadalupe locals. It was not encouraging. Guadalupe had hardly changed since 1923, and the company that rented out the Guadalupe Dunes was still in business. At their offices, Parker found their 1923 contract with DeMille.
That said second party will dismantle all buildings erected on said property of first party and will remove therefrom all said material from said buildings and all other refuse and rubbish within 30 days after the completion of said filming.
So this does seem to indicate that everything had to be removed from the property.
Well, that's the way we interpreted it.
We may be on a wild goose chase at this point, trying to locate the remains of this movie set.
How strong are your beliefs?
Other locals were equally skeptical, like Attilio de Gasparis. He often visited the site over the years. He even spoke with Alan Chapman, the man who took the set down.
And he told me that he remembered that they cut the cables and dropped the whole set. And then, as far as the sphinxes are concerned, they're hollow, and they would be very easy to completely destroy. That's why I doubt very much if you'd find any complete.
Was the lost city just a dream, or had DeMille simply pulled a fast one on Union Sugar and buried the set? There was one way to find out.
To give you an idea of the types of artifacts that we're finding, if you look down here, you can see the hieroglyphs to make it look like Egyptian hieroglyphics on the front of the movie set. We're finding bits and pieces of cloth from the costumes that were worn by the actors and extras, little bronze medallions that may have been worn on part of the costuming. We're also finding artifacts that tell us a little bit about what life was like in the 1920s. This is a medicine bottle, probably cough syrup. Maybe the actor had a cold, or this may have been a convenient way to get a little alcohol in your system after a hard day on the set. With just a couple of days' work, all this material found just on the surface, I think we have a real good chance of finding a lot of real interesting things once we start the excavation out here.
The archaeologists were joined by a real celebrity, Dr. Lambert Dolphin from the Stanford Research Institute, one of the inventors of ground-penetrating radar.
Yeah, let's pull.
This isn't like this real big.
Straight out about 80 feet from where we are here, you should hit the first Sphinx if there's one out there.
Well, that's very helpful.
That'll get us started anyway.
We got about 10 nanoseconds going.
Okay.
So we're looking at about 18 full screen.
Recorder's on.
We're ready to go.
All right, let's go up over here.
All right, let's go find some Sphinx.
Everybody pulling evenly, 1 horsepower each. We're not allowed to use motor vehicles up here on this protected area to drag the cart around, so we're just using physical manpower. So it's a lot of work for 3 men to tow it.
You can't let the doc dupe you into bringing you. Starts telling you about high adventure and all that stuff.
And we're hopeful that the radar can find the sphinxes if any of them are remaining out here in the sand.
As word got out, locals began dropping by to share memories of the 10 Commandments.
They were hiring people in Guadalupe. They were going around Guadalupe and asking little kids and so forth, you know, if they wanted to be part of the troupe, you know, part of the movie. I was with my sister, and that was a big experience at the time. And I found some interesting pieces of wood and some nails, and I made some of these crosses and gave them to some of my friends. To some people, it would be a superstition. And to some people, it would mean a tremendous amount as a memento of the 10 Commandments.
Looks smooth and clean all the way. Oops, there's a big anomaly right there.
We got something?
Whoa. That's a big one. See it right here? Fairly extensive.
So it's about 6 feet underground?
Yeah.
Put a flag on it.
Where are we? We're kind of on the line of the sphinxes, aren't we? Yeah, this is the main echo down here, about 6 feet deep. There's the main echo. And there, you can see a little wiggle up here, which is this little bit of a burning bush that sticks through the top of the ground here.
A little symbolic. Maybe it's the burning bush. Let my people go and all that stuff.
That might be, yeah.
All right.
This is a multiple signal. Okay.
All right. This is almost certainly one of those Ramsey statues.
Yeah, you can really see the torso here.
Wow, this is massive.
Look at the size of the shoulder.
This would be his chest, I guess. His pectoral muscles.
Right. Yeah, look at that forearm. Look at how big the muscle is on this guy.
Yeah, this is his bicep. There's his shoulder. There's the mantle that he was wearing, and his head. Something like this is going to make believers out of a lot of people.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. This is immense.
That's fantastic.
It's amazing how much really is preserved below the surface up here.
Hey, hey, hey.
What you got there?
I think we have an eye. This might be a face.
A face. Oh, yeah. Look. There's a nose.
All right.
This looks like maybe an eyebrow right here.
Hey.
Yeah, this looks good here.
This is the pharaoh, baby.
All right, yeah, we got the face of a pharaoh. That's amazing. Look at that.
You know, we got half the media in the world coming here tomorrow. I was getting worried that well, we were going to have egg on our face in a serious way.
They definitely have something to look at now.
With a few more hours' work, it turned out that we had found much more than just the pharaoh's head. We had found the whole top half of one of the bas-reliefs that once graced the city of the pharaoh. Like this one, it originally stood more than 20 feet tall.
These blue flags mark some 23 radar anomalies we've found in the last 2 days. Very few of them on the eastern avenue of the sphinxes, but a large number of them appear to line up where the sphinxes were on the left side of the main temple. And I think that about wraps us up, so let's go home, men.
Alan Chapman, you know, the guy that was responsible for taking down most of the set here, he had told me that he had buried the sphinxes in a ditch all the way along through there.
Right out where Lambert just found all the...
Where all those blue flags are lined up out there.
Yeah. We found our sphinxes.
Yeah.
Could be. We got a lot of digging to do.
You may have.
Let's bring on the press now. I'm ready.
Okay. Press time.
The next morning, the press came, and they came in droves. They shot film, they shot video, they shot the statues, they shot Attilio, they shot each other. They shot each other shooting each other. And when it was all over, the whole world heard about what we'd found. DeMille would have loved it.
archaeologists have begun excavating the city of the pharaohs.
But the dig isn't near the Nile, it's near the Pacific.
An ancient Egyptian city.
It was the biggest set ever built for the most expensive movie that had ever been made.
There wasn't enough money to lug all the props and sets back to Hollywood. So what did he do?
They buried it. They buried the entire set.
What worried the archaeologists who are digging this project is the sphinxes might have disappeared, never to be found.
Their most exciting discovery to date is outlined by these blue flags.
スフィンクスやラムセスが姿を現すことになるはずです。
But it had to be a Cecil B. DeMille set that archaeologists would be digging up.
The next step now is to find sponsors to finance the project and hopefully save a piece of Hollywood history.
We had proved the lost city was really there. Bank of America was delighted with the good publicity they'd gotten. Paramount told a Hollywood reporter they were waiting for our proposal. The Nature Conservancy enthusiastically supported us, and the PBS flagship stations in New York and Los Angeles wanted our documentary. It was the folks on Anapamu Street, and they were livid. Before the survey began, I talked to the Nature Conservancy's man in Guadalupe. I showed him the letter that we had saying we didn't need a permit. He said, do not even go back to the permit people. If you do, they'll take 2 years to decide that you don't need a permit. You got the letter saying you don't need a permit, you're not even going to be digging, go ahead. So that's what we did. Well, now the permit people would not even look at our letter until we paid them for a sit-down meeting. The DeMille family helped us out, and Parker and I went back to Anapamu Street, where they began telling us about the dreaded coastal development permit. They seemed to think that because we'd gotten a lot of publicity, we must have a lot of money. When I finally got them to look at this letter saying we did not need a permit, there was stunned silence. But it was an official county document, they were stuck with it. But they found other ways to beat us up. It was over a year before our excavation plan was approved, no permit needed. Then they came up with one more demand. Our sponsor was Hollywood Heritage, who were based in Hollywood. Now the permit people said only a museum in Santa Barbara can sponsor this project. We had to go to every single museum in Santa Barbara and get a letter from them saying they were not interested in sponsoring the project. This took almost another year. By the time we got the final sign-off, over 2 years had passed since our initial survey. And by then, the world had changed. Bank of America was in a merger. They were in no position to be digging up old movie sets. At Paramount, there was a new administration. Our phone calls were not returned. We wrote to everyone we could think of in the industry and got turned down. In 1993, we got a call from the University of San Diego. Their archaeologists thought the Lost City was a great project, and they applied to the National Endowment for the Humanities. They were rejected. One reviewer asked why some of these well-moneyed film industry groups weren't footing the bill. That was it. Parker and I gave up. Parker finished up his PhD and began doing a lot of archaeology in California. I finished up my degree and began doing child abuse investigations for Los Angeles County. We were done with the Lost City. Hours and hours of interviews went into boxes in my garage. I really wanted to forget about it. And in Guadalupe, the last of the people who had worked with DeMille passed away. The Ten Commandments had been a huge financial success, but Adolf Zucker was still bitter.
Cecil, you have never been one of us.
Zucker fired DeMille.
My long life had had few bitterer moments.
DeMille set up his own studio, Cecil B. DeMille Pictures. It was a tremendous gamble. In 1927, he made King of Kings, his masterful telling of the story of Christ with H.B. Warner. DeMille deliberately filmed the crucifixion on Christmas Eve.
When they wrapped the scene, there were just these 3 crosses in the twilight of the evening. And Grandfather said anybody who wants to can say a prayer if they'd like, whatever religion you are, whatever your faith, please do. Everyone on that set, and there were hundreds and hundreds, all knelt and prayed to whatever God they believed in.
The film sparked a religious revival and became a box office hit. DeMille donated his profits to charity. His decision to go independent seemed vindicated. But then, audiences couldn't afford to eat, let alone go to the movies. DeMille himself took a beating in the stock market crash. Cecil B. DeMille Productions closed. For a short time, DeMille worked at MGM, but he frequently clashed with Louis B. Mayer, just as he had with Adolf Zukor. He again found himself a man without a studio. It was DeMille's lowest moment. 50 years old, unemployed, and nearly broke, he could not find a job in the city and the industry he had practically created. With nothing to lose, he asked for a job at Paramount. He was offered a one-picture deal, but Adolf Zukor drove a hard bargain. DeMille would have to put up half the funding himself, all that remained of his fortune. This was DeMille's last chance. The sign of the cross was vintage DeMille. Christian martyrs thrown to wild beasts, side by side with Claudette Colbert's breasts. It was a tremendous success, and DeMille was back at Paramount for good. DeMille would make a fortune on the Bible, but in his personal life, DeMille was no saint. He had at least 2 long-running affairs with writer Jeannie McPherson and actress Julia Fay. And the parties at his private ranch, aptly named Paradise, were legend. DeMille apparently made his own peace with his creator. He lived his life and made his films accordingly. In private, he was a devoted family man, married to Constance Adams for over half a century. They had 4 children, 3 of them adopted. At work, DeMille was famous for his temper. When he felt the need to exert control, he would let loose, often upon the least significant person on the set. He is seen in true form here on the set of The Crusades.
Quiet, quiet, quiet. We're trying to take a scene here. You people chatter like a lot of monkeys. Now keep quiet and attend to your business. What's that girl doing over there with a 1935 headdress? You know, this isn't a fantasy, this is history.
Those who knew him well said that the tantrums were all an act, and DeMille was, in truth, a very warm man.
You're the girl with the wig. Yeah. Haven't been in pictures very long, have you?
It seems long, Mr. DeMille. Almost a year.
No.
The Crusades was one of DeMille's favorite films. It did poorly in America. It did very well, however, in the Middle East, where audiences were impressed by DeMille's even-handed portrayal of Arabs and Muslims. He showed them as civilized, just, and compassionate. This would not be forgotten in the Muslim world. The Second World War came and went. DeMille's movies grew ever more spectacular and ever more popular. The age of television dawned. Movie audiences stayed home in droves, but they kept coming to DeMille's movies. More than any other director, he kept Paramount alive. In 1952, The Greatest Show on Earth won the Oscar for Best Picture. DeMille, now in his 70s, was at the height of his career and looking for his next project. He had seen the Nazis rise and fall. He watched as the Soviet Union grew in strength. He decided that one more time, people needed to be reminded of the law, and he knew what his next project would be. But it would have to be approved by his longtime nemesis, Adolf Zukor. As the 1990s moved on, Parker and I tried to forget about the Lost City. But the damn phone kept ringing. The Lost City had become an evergreen story, and reporters came from all over the world. In Guadalupe, people began coming from all over the world to see where the 10 Commandments had been made. And other people made movies at the very least inspired by the Lost City. Before he made the Lord of the Rings movies, Peter Jackson made a mockumentary called Forgotten Silver. It has a silent-era filmmaker building a huge biblical movie set, then abandoning it in the jungle. Archaeologists dig it up. The Sci-Fi Channel did this thing called Sands of Oblivion. They show DeMille burying the set, and then an archaeologist named Carter digs it up. But he unleashes an ancient Egyptian demon, and everyone gets killed.
We couldn't get funding for the excavation or for the dig, and now people are making movies about us and having Egyptian demons kill us all off.
Around 1997, the Nature Conservancy got fed up with the Santa Barbara permit people. They gave up their plan for a visitor center on the dunes and pulled out. But before they left, they created a small nonprofit educational outfit, the Dunes Center. One of the Dunes Center's first acts was to offer to be our sponsor. They organized a weekend fundraiser in 1998, a day in the dunes with DeMille. There was a wine tasting party. They showed the 1923 Ten Commandments in Guadalupe's old movie theater. Parker and I gave a tour of the site, and hundreds of people got to meet the guest of honor, 85-year-old Pat Moore, who played the pharaoh's son in 1923. Around the same time, Parker and I recovered the pharaoh's face. It had been dug up and damaged by vandals. We had no permit, but leaving the face there meant losing it to the wind. We found an art conservator named Amy Higgins, who did a great job of putting it back together again. It became the first Lost City artifact on display at the Dunes Center. Things finally looked promising. One of the county supervisors, Tom Urbanski, got behind us, and we got a letter from none other than the Chief County Council explaining exactly why we did not need the coastal development permit. The cities of Guadalupe and Santa Maria and the Santa Barbara County Board of Supervisors all got behind us. Proclamations were issued, and some serious seed money was raised. We hoped it would spur Hollywood to finally back the project. We wrote directly to Paramount. Our only reply was through a newspaper.
A Paramount executive, asked about the studio's possible interest, laughed out loud when the excavation was mentioned.
Why does anyone care is my question. For crying out loud, it's from 75 years ago?
We tried Bank of America, but they'd now been taken over by a bank in South Carolina. Same name, but it was no longer A.P. Giannini's bank. They gave us $2,000. That was it. Parker and I gave up again. Parker got married, moved up north, and did a lot of Indian archaeology. I got married, had 2 kids, and began teaching my kids how to make movies. We were done with the Lost City. But the damn phone still kept ringing. Word was out that we were interviewing people who'd worked with DeMille. People would call and say, "You got to talk to my neighbor. He worked with DeMille on the 1956 version of the film." Once again, we realized that history was slipping through our fingers, so we kept on filming interviews, this time about the second version of the Ten Commandments. DeMille presented his idea for a new version of the Ten Commandments. One Paramount executive called it the stupidest idea he'd ever heard of. Other executives agreed. Things looked bad for DeMille. Then 80-year-old Adolf Zukor raised his hand for silence.
Gentlemen, we have just lived through a horrible war where our people was systematically executed. Now, Cecil, a Gentile no less, wants to make a movie on the life of Moses. I, for one, I won't hear of us not making the Ten Commandments, whatever it costs. For the first time in my life, I had a completely free hand.
This time, the Ten Commandments would be filmed in Egypt. As always, DeMille began with research. Historian Henry Nordlinger consulted the Bible, the Koran, and the works of Josephus to flesh out the life of Moses. DeMille's team eventually developed a story of 2 brothers, one a Hebrew slave and one a prince of Egypt. DeMille sent scouts to begin hunting for suitable locations. He negotiated with King Farouk for permission to film in Egypt. The task of designing the picture fell to art director Walter Tyler. His first assignment was to recreate Paul Iribe's City of the Pharaoh. And it wasn't easy because Iribe left no notes.
Actually, we had to look at the film, and we had no drawings of his, and that was the main problem, that we had to create our own.
Soon, Tyler's team had a crew making preparations in Cairo.
I telegraphed my construction man. I said, "Mr. DeMille, okay to go ahead and build it?" He sat down and cried. He didn't know how he'd ever get this thing built. They had to get scaffolding from France. They had to get paint and thinners from Alexandria. And they'd go to a paint store and say, "How much thinners do you have?" And they said, "Well, we have a quart." He said, "No," he says, "I want a barrel full." He said, "You're crazy." But our painter, head painter, he finally collected enough stuff to do it.
Like a ghost from the Guadalupe Dunes, once again, the city of the Pharaoh rose over the sands. As DeMille prepared to leave for Egypt, there was a startling development. King Farouk was overthrown. The army was now in control. The new leader was a young Egyptian officer named Abdel Nasser, and it was Nasser and his staff who greeted a very nervous DeMille.
Nasser was there with Akim Amr, who was the head of the military. The 2 men started to laugh, to smile. Grandfather said he was disconcerted and started again, and they did that again. And Nasser said, "Excuse us, Mr. DeMille, but when we were young, we saw the Crusades. We saw the way you treated the Arab. We saw the way you treated the Muslims, the way you depicted Salah el-Din. This country is yours. Do what you like.
In the very near future, Nasser would seize the Suez Canal. There would be a war with Israel. British and French troops and ships would be involved. The US and the Soviet Union would be at the brink of war. But for now, the Egyptian army was working for General DeMille. For one golden moment, there was peace in the Middle East. Immediately after his meeting with Nasser, DeMille hurried to the outskirts of Cairo, where workers were finishing the city of the Pharaoh.
We came over that sand dune, and there is this set, 150 feet high, I don't know how long, 300 feet, with a line of sphinxes. And the set is colorful. It's all in color with the rearing horses. Everybody got chills. Some people brought tears to their eyes. It was just absolutely magnificent. And you could just tell Grandfather taking a sigh of relief because everything was perfect. The scaffolding was still up in case any change had to be made, but it was perfection.
It was time to begin production. By ferry, the crew crossed the Suez Canal, the first step in their journey to Mount Sinai.
That was quite a spiritual trip for him. They stayed at the St. Catherine's Monastery in Sinai, and the history of that, the biblical history, is incredible.
The monastery sits in the very shadow of Mount Sinai, but getting up that mountain was not easy.
Because it's just a path. Well, that's me with a hat on. If you notice, those are the single hump camels, and they're horrible to ride.
Filming on the very ground where Moses stood, DeMille and his crew were exhilarated. But it was a tough shoot under harsh conditions: sun, heat, and thin mountain air. DeMille pushed himself as hard as he pushed the crew and cast. For the great scene of the Exodus, an army descended on the set. Hundreds of cameramen and technicians, 10,000 animals, and 10,000 extras.
We didn't hire extras. We hired villagers.
We hired their women, their children, their animals, their flocks. They came by the thousands.
That's where the assistant director came in.
He had over about 150 second assistant directors dressed in costume.
And each one of them would have a walkie-talkie, so in the crowd, it was like a sergeant telling so many people what to do.
You realize that this is the way it had been.
He invited all the high officials of Cairo to come the day we shot that. And he said to Chuck Heston, "Now don't you yell out, 'Hear, O Israel!' These are Arabs. They may resent it." Bill told him, he said, "Just open your mouth, we'll put the words in later." So, of course, Chuck got carried away with his scene and he yelled it out at the top of his voice.
"Hear, O Israel! Remember this day when the strong hand of the Lord leads you out of bondage."
But he yelled it out, and DeMille said, "I knew he would."
Coming hard on the heels of the trip to Sinai, the relentless shooting schedule took its toll on the crew, especially on the 73-year-old DeMille.
He had been warned by his doctors not to exert himself physically. Now remember that he had climbed to the top of Mount Sinai.
DeMille always wanted the best vantage point. That usually meant a ladder. And the tallest ladder on the set was the one that led to the very top of the city of the Pharaoh, where cameraman John Fulton was filming.
Mr. DeMille said, "What did John Fulton see in his camera up there?" And I said, "I don't know. I've been busy down here. I haven't gone up there." He says, "Well, I'd have to do it myself." So 4 times that day, he climbed up to see what John was getting. It was 107 feet high and a straight up and down ladder.
He starts climbing up this little ladder, straight up, and halfway up has a massive heart attack. Getting him down was very difficult. We took him home and got a doctor, and the doctor said he's finished. He cannot move for a month. DeMille said, "I will be on the set the next day."
All of a sudden I looked, you? Oh boy, he was miraculous. That's why I say that he must have been religious.
Supported by a cane and defying his doctors, DeMille finished filming in Egypt. If there was one thing constant about the Lost City project, it was the publicity. But I think some people don't read the newspapers.
Paramount seems flummoxed by the situation. A spokesman had never heard of the buried set and couldn't find anyone at Paramount who had.
Are you sure this guy isn't a kook?
Okay, I'm a kook. Other people have made similar observations.
Peter has an abiding fascination with his subject, and it verges on the manic, I think, to be honest. It's a Captain Ahab kind of obsession.
You need somebody with total obsession and dedication that will not stop until the job is completed.
We got told no an awful lot. No, we're not going to give you money. No, we're not going to give you permits. No, there's nothing buried there. Maybe it was my obsessive side, but damn it, I was going to prove to the world that there was something buried there.
By now, technology had entered the picture. It would be possible to put all the interviews I had together on my Mac at home and finally finish at least a short version of the film. I got a grant from the DeMille estate and began working on getting all that old footage digitized. I figured this was where the project would end. Then along came that old troublemaker, the Los Angeles Times. They put it right on the front page. Here we go again. A few days later, the phone rang. It was the reporter from the LA Times. He said a very nice lady from Texas had called and wanted to fund the entire project. The excavation, the film, everything.
I stalled calling her for a few days. I just did not want to go through it again. So I gave her a call, and we set up a meeting. Part of me wanted to call it off, but then part of me said, you know, you've been with this for 30 years. You've come so close to making this happen. Maybe this is really meant to be. Maybe you have to do this.
We met at a coffee shop in Los Angeles, and I tried to talk her out of it. But she wanted to get started right away. I told her about the protected birds on the site, no digging during nesting season, which runs May through September. Then I told her about all our permit problems with Santa Barbara County. She was still gung-ho.
So I said, let's be very careful. We want no surprises this time. It is now March 2010. Let's plan this for next year, October 2011. After October, it's the rainy season. We have to do this in October.
We hired John Parker to begin getting all the paperwork. He drove down from up north and went to Guadalupe, Santa Maria, and Santa Barbara. He got approvals from Fish and Wildlife, county parks, and lots of others. Once again, our project was ruled exempt. No coastal development permit needed. By April 2011, Parker began to hire an 8-man archaeological crew and rent supplies and workspace in Guadalupe. Guadalupe had been hard hit by the 2008 recession, and they really saw this as a blessing. We were ready to hit the ground on the first Monday in October 2011. After 29 years, the lost city was about to be uncovered.
It was the permit people on Anapamu Street. This whole thing began with a complaint made by the Chumash Indians.
The Chumash have been in Santa Barbara County just about forever. For the past few hundred years, they've been treated pretty badly. Today, things have changed. The Chumash are now a powerful economic and political force in Santa Barbara County. They're one of its biggest employers, and they have some pretty controversial expansion plans. About a week before the excavation, Parker got a call from a Chumash guy demanding that we hire one of his people as an observer. These observers sometimes get paid more than the archaeologists. Parker told the guy we couldn't afford it. So the guy turned around and called the head planner.
One day I was contacted by the Chumash tribe and they were upset that they had not been consulted. I determined that the exemption had been issued in error and that it was, unfortunately, necessary to process a coastal development permit.
No due process, no appeal, project canceled, just like that.
I really think they expected us to just go away quietly. That's not what happened. The permit people got a lot of bad publicity. So did the Chumash. A whole group of our supporters turned out at the Board of Supervisors meeting.
The project has come to a halt. The crew was notified of a layoff 72 hours before their mobilization. You can imagine how devastating that is for a project.
I'm a little concerned that recent permit difficulties related to this project
may cast a bit of a shadow on this fantastic reputation. This would have helped us with sales tax, would have helped us with exposure, hopefully trying to lure a hotel. There was international media coming into the community, which has been turned away.
Thank you, Mr. Albert. As you know, organizations, there's enough blame to go around sometimes with these projects.
I have to say that I am quite disappointed in what's happened here with county staff. There obviously was a very serious lack of communication and miscommunication.
The night before, we had been told there would be a teleconference after the meeting, and the permit people would arrange a way for us to begin digging.
My understanding, Ms. Waller, was that you were trying to pull together a meeting after today's hearing. Is that going to happen?
We have folks that are literally on their way up right now that could be.
But that's not what happened. When we finally talked to them, they told us we would need the permit. It would take 3 or 4 months to get it. They offered to pay for it, they offered to expedite it, but it still meant laying off our entire crew, and if we could begin again, it would be in rainy season, which we couldn't do. Parker told me somebody in Santa Barbara doesn't want this to happen. I said, John, you're being paranoid. Then I got a look at some of the internal documents from the head planner. Right around the time that Parker was going up to Santa Barbara, applying for all the permits, the head planner wrote to an associate.
The main thing I want to talk to you about, probably by phone, is John Parker.
The response was, "What is your cell?"
And just when it seemed like things could not possibly get any worse, John Parker left the project in utter frustration. Parker will no longer talk about the lost city, but he did tell a newspaper,
I don't have the energy. I put 21 years into this to see it start up and fail, start up and fail. We had the permits and the funding, and to see the county yank permits 24 hours before we began work, I can't take that. It's not something I can handle or deal with.
We finally had the coastal development permit, and the Lost City project was dead again. Returning to Hollywood, DeMille regained his health. The Bible was ever at his side. Every day he prayed for strength. Finishing the 10 Commandments now was everything.
It was a story of man's belief in God that triumphed over kings and dictators and people that enslaved people. The only ruler man had was God, and he truly believed in that story.
DeMille plunged into his work, directing the studio sequences of the 10 Commandments.
Everyone else had trouble keeping up with him. He may have nearly died in Egypt, but what I saw was a man with, in the way he would say it, vigor.
As always, DeMille brought in old friends. Julia Fay, who played Pharaoh's wife in 1923, now would play the wife of Aaron. Another of DeMille's old friends lay dying in a nursing home. But DeMille accommodated his request for a part in the 10 Commandments.
Of course, it's in the crossing of the Red Sea, and Donald Curtis, as Merid, is carrying this very small, frail, thin old man in his arms.
I am poured out like water. My strength dried up into the dust.
I would not have known what was going on, but my mother, God bless her, said to me, mark you well what you're seeing. That man, H.B. Warner, played Christ for Mr. DeMille in The King of Kings. And this is a really important moment that you're witnessing.
As in 1923, the toughest shot of all would be the parting of the Red Sea. And this time, there would be no Jell-O. It was the most ambitious and complex motion picture sequence ever attempted.
Mr. DeMille said, I don't want any of this low tide stuff that they write about. He says, I want a wall of water on my left and a wall of water on my right. I said, you want sharks in it? He said, no, it's just a wall of water.
The entire Paramount back lot was rebuilt to accommodate huge water tanks, flowing, rippling, cascading, millions of gallons of moving, rushing water photographed from every conceivable angle. It was Cecil B. DeMille at his peak.
Behold his mighty hand!
The Ten Commandments opened on October 5th, 1956. It would go on to become one of the most successful films in history. Before John Parker left the project, he gave me the name of a buddy of his who ran an archaeological firm called Applied Earthworks. They agreed to take on the Lost City project, and the Chumash Indians donated a monitor.
Back around 1990, 1992, I showed the rough cut of my film to a couple of distributors. And they all said the same thing. You don't have enough. You set out to find a Sphinx, you gotta find a Sphinx. You have to have the face of a Sphinx. That's your money shot.
The archaeologists would have only 15 days to find the face of a Sphinx.
What if we find nothing? What if the last 30 years have been this wild, quixotic goose chase and there's no payoff?
Okay, so let me just see.
Yeah, so we do want to identify what the goals are now and make sure we stay really focused on that, because we don't have that much time.
Right. From the point of view of the film, a Sphinx, obviously not a whole one. That would be the size of a UPS truck.
Right.
But the face, even if it comes out in pieces, it can be restored or filled in later on.
Okay, so number one target is a Sphinx.
Yeah.
Okay, and that is somewhere between here and the size of where we're standing at the moment.
Or it might be buried.
Or buried.
This field of plaster rubble that we're in the middle of was originally some of the bas-relief statues that were on the wall of the set. When we were out here in 1990, and even 10 years after that, a lot of this was still pretty much intact, but now it looks in pretty bad shape.
I think maybe we're better off to try to see if we can find some of the Sphinx pieces.
I'm go for that. Let's find a Sphinx.
Let's do that.
Okay, great.
The team started digging where the 1990 radar data showed buried plaster. But after days of digging, all they had found was sand. There were even questions about where the 1990 map was positioned. They may have been digging in the wrong place. Time for Plan B.
We are now right in the middle of the gate here. The Sphinxes were right out in front of us, 20 of them in 2 rows. In 1990, we got these radar hits where we believe Sphinxes are buried. Since 1990, farther out, the sand has piled up about 10 feet, so these ones are going to be even 10 feet deeper. But right in front of us, I think these rubble piles here are probably these buried Sphinxes.
So what I would want to do would be to start opening trenches by these 2 visible piles that we can see in front of us.
All right, a lot of work to do.
Yeah. This site is a gift from the past. It's a gift from people who lived way back then to us today, even though they didn't mean to give it to us. And therefore it can tell us a lot about how they lived, how they worked, how they made movies back then.
When I first heard about this project, I was really excited. This is historic archaeology because it represents a specific event in time, one that would be considered of note.
I work with cultural material and artifacts a lot, so I'm really hopeful to find few of the items they were used in their daily life on the scene.
The archaeologists targeted 3 areas. Areas 1 and 2 had visible portions of plaster statues, maybe sphinxes exposed by the wind. Area 3 was where they had already found nothing. Sometimes archaeology runs on intuition. Jack McElroy noticed a funny-shaped piece of plaster, and he began digging.
And I thought it might have represented the toe of a sphinx. We decided we had actually got the back end of a sphinx sitting on its haunches, something like that. I'm looking at the rear end of a sphinx. Thank God it's made of plaster. So the whole thing is kind of at an angle like this. We know how big it is now. Nice thing now would be to find the head. Every day will be a new revelation.
A few meters away, there was a second mound of plaster, still with its original paint. That meant it had only recently been uncovered by the wind. Could this be where we'd find our missing head?
Let's see where we are.
Oh, this is interesting.
Yeah, we have large blobs of fairly intact sphinx. The headdress over there and the ornamentation. So this area is our main target as far as excavation goes. We're getting fragments of formed plaster with the original ochre paint still in place. And, you know, we're putting together kind of Franken-Sphinx at the end of this, but it's going to be from bits and pieces from all over the place.
We'll find one piece at a time and try and figure out how they go together.
So if that's the paw, and the paw was here, and the face was here, then the face went down. And,
Which would make sense if that's the headdress.
Yeah.
The face is right there, I'm telling you. I know it.
What can we do?
Well, as soon as we clean up, I'm going to be looking for that face. Probably nose and eyes and everything this time.
It was becoming obvious that if we did find a face, it would be in pieces. It would take a real pro to put this back together. Amy Higgins, who put the pharaoh's face together 10 years earlier, was the perfect person.
Amy, I'm beginning to get a little worried. So far, we've found one sphinx, but it has no head.
Really?
Just the other day, the archaeologists found a big mound of plaster. They think they're going to find maybe a couple of faces in there, but they're all broken up.
So
we should be able to
combining several, picking the best.
It seemed like a mad jumble of broken plaster, but little by little, the form began to appear.
I think I've got the lips and hopefully a chin, and we'll see how far it goes underneath.
We're going to have to kind of choose our battle, which is...
Save the lips.
Save the lip.
The archaeologists were certain there was a sphinx's face here. They had 2 days.
I'm trying to assess your aggressive time schedule right here, because you want to walk away with some choice, good pieces that'll be dynamic in display.
That's awesome. Finally, I figured out what that was, and sure enough, it's the nose.
That's one of the largest fragments, I think, that we've had out of here so far.
Yeah,
So,
and cool. So discovery of the day is the Sphinx nose. Except for we're missing the eyes, unfortunately. I'm not sure what happened to the eyes.
Yeah, that eye was proving elusive, but you can hardly kick the sand on this site without finding something that says DeMille was here.
This is really cool. It's Eastman Kodak film can. It's probably 1920s, so right about the time when the filming was done, which makes sense.
It was the last day of the dig. I was giving up on finding an eye.
It's true. Up here is.
And then came the moment.
I think we have an eye. I think we have an eye.
Usually in an archaeological dig, you'll find there's always a surprise, and usually it comes on the last day. Our surprise today was that we found the eye of the Sphinx. So we've got the eye, you've got your face.
The 1923 version of the Ten Commandments was the first of DeMille's biblical epics. The 1956 version was the last film he produced or directed. On the evening of January 20th, 1959, DeMille scribbled some notes on a piece of paper.
The Lord giveth, and the Lord taketh away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. It can only be a short time before those words, the first in the Episcopal funeral service, are spoken over me. After those words are spoken, what am I? I am only what I have accomplished.
The following morning, Cecil B. DeMille passed away. He was 77 years old.
We've had so many people come in here this week trying to peek under here.
3, 2, 1.
30 years ago, I set out to find a Sphinx. Along the way, I found myself walking through a slice of history. In 1923, DeMille was here with hand-cranked 35mm cameras. 60 years later, we came along with 16mm and sound. Later, we switched to video. Now, we're wrapping up with digital high-def, and my kids are here filming me with an iPhone. I'm glad we found that Sphinx, but for me, the real treasure is the voices and faces, the stories we've saved, from those people who were profoundly touched by their encounters with a man named Cecil B. DeMille. Pat Moore recalled shooting one scene.
I'd been dead in 2 or 3 pictures. In the Queen of Sheba, I was dead in the tombs of the King of Sheba. And I remember Noble Johnson carrying me up through between 2 or 4 of these leopards up to the Pharaoh. And
seeing them there.
Noble Johnson appeared in hundreds of films up through the 1960s. One of the earliest and most successful African-American actors, he plowed much of his earnings into the Lincoln Motion Picture Company, the first all-black Hollywood film studio. Noble Johnson, too, was part of the Ten Commandments story.
It was a chemical smoke, is what it was. And the set was built on an incline, and down at this end, I had a huge suction machine that would create a draft going out. So as he burned it up at the other end, I would suck it down on this end, take it out of the stage. It was terrible. And it was bad for you. They say that my chronic bronchitis is probably due to a lot of the chemicals. But every fire that we used, like campfires, burning fires on the walls and stuff like this, we used benzene because it had a nice color to it. We never thought about it. But I hope they learn.
Okay. To drive his chariots, DeMille again turned to the army, the Egyptian army.
110 of them, I think we had, and they'd wreck them every day. They would practice and wreck them. Come back with the tongues like this, we'd have to go out and rebuild them. And I had to send them back because they said they were too rough riding. So I had springs put on them, on each chariot. They were terrible.
Yeah, this staff is from one of the Rudolph Valentino movies, The Sheik or The Son of the Sheik. And just by, which he filmed out here in the sand dunes, just by coincidence, our local blacksmith shop at that time, the owner had, and Valentino grew up together in Italy. And they would, after the filming during the day, the chauffeur would bring him into the blacksmith shop, and they would reminisce about their old girlfriends and buddies and stuff, and they would have their French bread and salami and wine.